recently had an argument online. I know, big shocker, I'm usually such an agreeable person, but I felt this one was worth documenting as I seem to be having it on a semi-regular basis. As you can probably guess, the image currently on screen has a lot to do with it, as I'll now explain. You see, I was critiquing capitalism, as all the cool kids do nowadays, and was sent this image as a response, along with a long message that covered the exact same talking points capitalism defenders love to repeat ad nauseum. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to embark upon one of my more short-form analyse infographics videos that I should probably think up a name for at some point. The basic thrust behind the argument is that what we on the left criticise as capitalism is not real capitalism, but is in fact crony capitalism or corporatism. Now, to me, this concept of corporatism just seems like a natural progression from capitalism as far as I can see. Quite often, this image is used to support this hypothesis. Now, as you might imagine, I see a number of egregious problems with this argument as well as the associated image, so I'll lay out my reasoning here. First of all, one of the defining traits of capitalism is to take control of and exert influence or pressure over law, government policy, etc., as we see with lobbying more and more corporation-affiliated people gaining office or positions of power. The current president of the United States is a billionaire businessman who uses his position of power to hawk his shitty golfing resorts and red hats, and arguably helps to cover up the murder of a journalist in order to preserve personal business interests. And in the UK, it's just accepted that MPs will just have numerous corporate affiliations, including the current Prime Minister's husband growing and selling medical marijuana to companies operating overseas, despite the fact that cannabis is a Class B banned substance in the UK, and a lot of people are in prison for selling small amounts of it on the streets, something which my local police force was proud of and did not appreciate me questioning. Therefore, the first few points are kind of irrelevant. Okay, so government-run public utilities are not capitalist, I will concede that, although parts of them can be. For example, the Tories selling off large parts of the NHS and contracting out to Virgin Care, who then fucked the parts they took over up and turned around and sued the government. But does that make them corporatist? Is the government a corporation? Companies and corporations being too big to fail and needing to be bailed out by governments is still capitalism. In fact, it shows that our society is so deeply reliant on capitalism that it cannot be allowed to collapse. So much for the free market deciding. Take the banks, for example. What is the purpose of a bank if not to gain more and more money? And further, what is the goal of capitalism if not to concentrate more and more money in less and less hands? With regards to subsidies, British Rail, for example, was cheaper to run than the privatised rail system is now, despite the entire rail network being run by private companies. Sean made a great video going into a lot more depth about it than I will, so click the thing if you haven't seen it already. Was British Rail capitalism despite being a public service? If so, then what is the current rail system, other than shit? Was British Rail corporatism, but privately owned rail is just capitalism? Are they both corporatism? How can they both be the same thing if the ownership and structure is so different? Or is it only corporatism when the companies get too big? Isn't the accumulation of wealth literally the only point of capitalism? How is corporatism anything other than the logical conclusion to that idea? If anything run by the state is corporatism, then was the USSR the first fully corporatist state? If modern liberal capitalist democracies and authoritarian communism can be put in the same category, maybe there's a flaw in that argument. I'm just saying. Again, capitalists having influence over governments in order to gain exclusive rights to certain contracts and services is the whole point. The purpose of capitalism is for the capitalists to own all the wealth physically possible, even, perhaps especially, if that means bribing governments, using child slavery, destroying ecosystems, etc. This is why anti-capitalists like myself oppose it. You don't just get to say, oh no, all the bad parts of capitalism are just this other thing I made up. True capitalism is the things I like about our current society. This is a huge point that deserves its own video and may very well end up with one at some point, but the part of this image that causes the rest of it to completely fall apart is simply that the entire capitalist system is based on violence and a lack of consent as well. There was this whole slavery thing a couple of centuries back during early capitalism, which is arguably not ended if you take into consideration wage slavery or American prison labour, or indeed any number of actual examples of real slavery in the real world. Not sure if you've heard of it. You're forced to work, given the majority of the wealth you produce to your employer, and if you refuse, the state has the right to starve you, force you to rely on food banks, remove your means of supporting yourself, repossess your home, kick you out into the street, and then cut homeless services to hurt you just a little bit more. And that's without going into things like law and the police and the incredible disparity when it comes to sentences doled out to the rich as opposed to the poor for the same crimes. Employers, landlords, etc. are some of the most singularly violent people on the planet. Just because it isn't quite so in your face, that doesn't make it less serious. As I mentioned in a previous video, if you kick a homeless man to death in the street, most people will see that as violent. Correctly. But if you directly cause that same homeless man to starve or freeze to death due to enacting or supporting cuts to benefits, homeless support, etc., is that not also just as violent? Not to mention that having the ability to end all poverty, world hunger, etc., and choosing not to do so due to greed is inherently a violent act. Billionaires could end poverty 7 times over just through their profits. And Elon Musk, for just one example, uses his immense wealth to put a car into space rather than addressing the appalling conditions in his factories. But doing nothing when you have the ability to stop people dying is not seen as violent, when realistically it absolutely should be. Conclusion. Just a quick one for you today. I just came across this and I felt I needed to make this. I realise that the image doesn't say this is corporatism, it just says not capitalism, but I base this video on the fact that this image is frequently used to demonstrate the apparent distinction between capitalism and corporatism, because otherwise what's even the point of the image? So apologies if it seems like I'm misrepresenting the intent of the image. Essentially, everyone who uses the corporatism argument is falling victim to the same things we on the left are often accused of. They are essentially making a no true capitalism argument, which is rather funny, really.